hello everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to this event at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. We're obviously sorry not to be with you all in person, but thanks very much to the hard work of the ORFC staff and volunteers. We are at least able to meet virtually, so we hope you still find the session sort of interesting and informative. Just a bit of housekeeping is just a reminder, please, that the session will be recorded, and please keep your microphone muted unless you're invited to speak, and this will help us both keep to time and also ensure that the speakers have the chance to get all of their points across. So, excuse me, my name is Steph Moran. I'm a Senior Policy Officer with the RSPB, so the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And for the last few years, I've been specifically working on pesticide policy. For the last 12 months, in partnership with Pesticide Action Network UK, have been coordinating a civil society collaboration to try and address pesticide-related harms in the UK, largely by influencing UK policy through a variety of different ways, from sort of coordinating engagement with DEFRA across civil society to increasing engagement and awareness with the public. The collaborators and partners that we're working with span both environmental and human health interests, and we work with people from NGOs, with farmers, with academics and more. So if you would like to know more about that, please get in touch or visit the website, which I will put the link for in the chat. So onto this session. So this session is called What is Needed to Get Us to a Pesticide-Free Future? And throughout the session, we hope to address some of the opportunities, solutions and barriers to enabling a widespread reduction in pesticide use. Now, given that this conference is all about celebrating and promoting agroecology and regenerative agriculture, we definitely don't need to convince you all that reducing pesticides to a minimum level is a good thing. But what we will try to do is share some practical examples from farmers who are achieving significant pesticide reduction, as well as discuss the role of policy, accreditation schemes and other measures in increasing uptake of integrated pest management and the role of pesticides in a regenerative agricultural system. So just for clarification, we're only talking about issues in a UK context here, and in fact, largely an England context. However, if you are joining us from elsewhere, you are most welcome, and there will definitely be practical tips you can take away from our fantastic speakers, and almost all of what we talk about will be relevant in other places too. So to start with, to help us get a sense of who is joining us today, I've got a very quick Mentimeter question. I will just put the link in the chat for you now. So if you click on there and just answer the simple question as to who you are, if it doesn't quite meet who you are, just the closest possible. So and I will share my screen so we can see that being filled in live now. Well, apologies for the incredibly tiny writing there on the bar chart. So we've got really widespread people from all different areas, so that's fantastic. Welcome to everybody. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. What is this session going to be? So we're going to start with 3 speakers, and then we'll have a question and answer panel session. What I'd like to ask is that we save all questions until after the 3 speakers are finished, but please, as you think of them, please do put your question in the chat. We'll monitor it, and then when we get to the panel session, we'll try to answer as many as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Becky Speight is the Chief Executive of the RSPB, and she's been in the role for just over 2 years. Before that was the Chief Executive of the Woodland Trust, and she joins us today to share some thoughts on the external policy context and why nature needs us to act now. So over to you. Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, Steph. And it's great to be here, although I feel like the fraud on the panel because I'm not a farmer and neither am I a policy expert. But am I concerned about pesticides, and do I think we need to do something about it? Absolutely. And for me, the issue is framed between 2 fantastic books, and you've probably all read them anyway, but I'm going to stick them up now. So one is the original Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, 60 years since it was published this year. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And the second is Silent Earth, which is Dave Goulson's book from last year, so almost exactly 60 years on, where he says the situation has got even worse since Carson was writing. So kind of a really interesting framing there for me. And Carson, in her opening remarks about the book, Carson quotes from Keats, and she says, "The sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing." And that's a line of Keats that she uses in her dedication to the book. And her final paragraph of the book, I'm just going to read to you. She says, "The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. The concepts and practices of applied entomology, for the most part, date from that Stone Age of science. It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth." That was her closing paragraph in 1962. And the RSPB is massively concerned about current levels of pesticide use. You know, there's growing evidence of harm, we know, to birds, insects, aquatic animals, water, soil health. And, you know, it's concerning just from a straight farming perspective as well, because we're talking about risk to pollinators, risk to soil organisms, you know, risk to beneficial predators. And we need all of those to have sustainable and profitable farming businesses. So, you know, there's risk all around. We need to do something about this. So what's the context we're in now? Well, it's broadly accepted, I think, that we are in a nature and a climate emergency, and that those two things are interlinked and that they are linked to human health as well. So there's a broad acceptance of that, and you'll hear many governments now talking about that across the UK. And we've just had the Environment Act come through, particularly for England and Northern Ireland as well. And that has got in it a very hard fought for legally binding target to halt species decline. And that by 2030, it said it wants to halt species decline. So that's absolutely fundamental. And farming, we know, occupies more than 70% of land across the UK. So it's clearly got a crucial role to play in terms of hitting that goal. And we know that at the moment, pesticides are still used too often as that first line of defence. And why is that? Well, there are all sorts of reasons, and I'll touch on those in a moment, but particularly there's a lack of proper investment from government and industry into researching the alternatives, we feel. And there's a lack of independent agronomic advice as well on the solutions that might kind of actually work with nature and use nature. So, you know, for example, encouraging beneficial pest predators, you know, that's not very accessible at the moment. And what's the impact of all of that from the RSPB's perspective? Well, I'll just give you one example, which is that last year when we looked at the birds of conservation concern, this is the kind of green, amber, red list. The red list is growing, and who did we have popping up on the red list for the first time but swifts? So they will be a bird that absolutely dines on insects, and they are in decline, in really kind of, you know, catastrophic decline we're talking about for a lot of these birds. But you know, many of the farmers in this session now, and particularly those on the panel, you know, are already doing a huge amount to cut out and reduce pesticides, and we're going to hear from them in a moment. But you know, how do we ensure that that's happening on a much more wide basis? It's still happening in quite a kind of, it feels like quite a narrow zone. How can we make it much wider? So, you know, it's in a way, it's the opposite of what I was saying. It's about more investment in research. It's about getting access to the independent advice. It's about things like the new ELMS scheme. So we're kind of, you know, there's been media all over that today in terms of the announcements of the second two tiers of the ELMS scheme. You know, we were the SFI, the first level of that scheme, which was announced last year, does talk about integrated pest management, but it talks about it in a way that we worry about, where we think it might just be a tick box exercise. It might not actually incorporate what I would call proper integrated pest management. It might not really reward that. So there are some concerns there, and it seems to be missing completely from the two tiers that were announced today. So kind of some concerns around that, around ELMS, and whether it's really going to push this agenda, and not only far enough, but fast enough as well. Because the big issue now, because of this crisis we're in, is that time is limited. We have to make the change now. And I can see Martin nodding, because I know he would have been saying that in the media just today. So, you know, what else have we got in terms of context? We've got the long-awaited National Action Plan for Sustainable Use of Pesticides, much promised, now saying it's going to kind of launch in spring 22. There's been a big consultation on it. We quite liked the initial draft, but we thought there wasn't enough on nature, there wasn't enough on use of pesticides in urban settings, and there was probably too much focus on the role of industry. So, you know, we like the commitment to targets, we like the acknowledgement that pesticide reduction is a good thing, but again, has it really gone far enough? So we will see when that comes out in spring whether it has. And, you know, Steph talked about the work we're doing with Pan UK. So we're really trying to push the agenda from the RSPB's perspective through that kind of collaborative work, through working on as wide as possible a range of people across civil society to get this change happen. But there are some real problems with getting this integrated pest management approach absolutely to happen. You know, people worry about the risk of significant yield loss. They worry about, you know, kind of, you know, the alternatives and do they have confidence in them? They kind of worry about that kind of peer pressure for having perfect crops. All of our research shows that these are all issues, and I'm sure that we're going to hear from the farmers on the panel about the ways in which they have tackled those and how they think we can kind of broaden that approach. So in kind of to close, having opened with Carson, I just wanted to read something from Dave Goulson at the end. So this is a book written 60 years later. And he says in his chapter all about farming and insects, he says, it's not the fault of farmers that we have ended up with a global food production system that is vastly inefficient and damaging to our health and that of the environment. We could blame government policies and subsidies, supermarkets, stock market traders, the agrochemical industry, or the choices we make when we shop. We are all at fault collectively. We all need farmers and farming, for without them, we would starve. We all have common interests in ensuring that farmers can make a decent living and produce sufficient food, while practicing methods that look after the soil, reduce carbon emissions, and encourage healthy populations of pollinators. No farmer wants to hand over their farm to their children in a degraded, depleted state. It is in all our interests to recognise the problems and together to find a way to remedy them. So I'm sure that our next speakers are going to talk about some of the ways they have found to address the issue and how we can ensure that that gets spread much more widely in the approach to sustainable farming. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks very much, Becky. It was brilliant. I loved how you started and ended with a quote. Really inspiring, and thanks very much for setting the scene for us there. So if anyone has any questions for Becky, do remember to put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we come back to them after all the speakers have presented. And we're now going to hear from Patrick Barker, a Suffolk farmer who's been trialling a nature-friendly integrated pest management approach on his farm for many years, and he's going to share some of his experiences with you today. Thanks, Patrick.
Right, thank you, Steph. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Barker, and I'm a farmer here in Suffolk. I also sit on the steering committee of the England branch of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and we are the AHDB strategic farm for the East, and we're also a leaf demonstration farm, so we've got our fingers in plenty of different pies. But we are a 545 hectare family farm, and we've been farming, my cousin Brian and I, we're the third generation to farm this farm, and the fourth generation of Arcus to farm our other farm over at Great Ashfield. So we're quite well ingrained into this, into what we do, and we've been given the controls of the farm for the last probably 15 years now. So we're kind of really got our feet under the table, and we've really developed a kind of a strategy on how we want to farm. We know what we're trying to achieve. We do probably the same again. I said 545 hectares. We do the same again in contracting and farm contracting, and we also do environmental contracting as well, which is running other people's environmental stewardship schemes for them, and specific conservation jobs, pond restoration, and other work like that, linked in with a bit of environmental consultancy. So we're kind of doing everything we can to run as efficient and as productive a business as possible from a farming and from an environmental point of view. And on our two farms here, we have a higher tier countryside stewardship scheme, which is just coming into its final year, its 5th year. And prior to that, we were running an HLS scheme. And the HLS scheme really set us up to farm in the way we are now and to really get the benefits of what we're doing now. So actually from this point on, we're going to start looking at what comes next in the future a whole lot more, because the next year really gives us a chance to start building the next scheme and looking at what comes next and how we can really improve on what we're doing. our focus has always been on farmland conservation, on habitat management, and on our farmland wildlife. And that's just because we've been brought up with it and we absolutely love our farmland wildlife. So by putting an HLS scheme together in when was it, 2007, which focused on grey partridges and great-crested newts, we knew that if we got the habitat right for both of those species, being the fussiest species that we have and the most difficult to get the habitat right for, if we could get the habitat right for them, then actually everything would benefit as a result. And that's what we've been able to do. Both our populations of grey partridges and great-crested newts have gone absolutely through the roof, and the whole farm ecosystem below them has done really, really well as well. And what we tried to do right at the start was to create a green corridor through the heart of the farm, link up all our habitats and increase the connectivity of our habitats, and try and get every habitat that we have to deliver as much as we can for our farmland wildlife. And I think originally we started trying to farm our arable area to the maximum we could from an arable point of view, and then try and make up the difference in sort of decades of farm change and farm intensification in the areas we weren't farming. And as time has gone on, we've actually realized that we are far better off trying to build a whole farm ecosystem. So trying to get the whole farm to work in harmony together, and that's what we're trying to do now. So we're trying to make sure that our entire farm is working for good arable production and for a really healthy yield of wildlife as well, on a farm that's absolutely bursting full of farmland wildlife. On these farms, we're proper heavy boulder clay. We're growing 2/3 of the farm is in winter cereals at any one time. So predominantly we're growing winter wheat, and we're growing oilseed rape, spring beans, spring linseed some years if it fits into the rotation, and spring barley. Our main break crop is ryegrass, it's herbage ryegrass. And that is one of the best crops we can grow for all our farmland wildlife. It's amazing that the brown hares, barn owls, grey partridges just seem to follow the ryegrass as it moves around the farm, and it just adds so much to the entire spectrum of farmland wildlife, but also to our soil structure as well. And in having ryegrass in the rotation actually gave us the kind of the foresight and the ability to build our soil health. And we've come to realize over time that a healthy soil is actually the foundation of our whole farming approach. So we then more recently have moved to a far greater reduced tillage system. There isn't a set term for what we do. It's not min-till, it's not zero-till. It's the appropriate tillage for the conditions of the field and the crop at the time. And all we're trying to do is as little as we possibly can to get really good crops established. And that is by building our soil health, building our ground organic matter, and just trying to make sure that what we're doing really works. More recently, we've kind of got a bit more focus into the way we're farming and the way we're trying to do it because of this. And we know policy is changing. Everyone knows, well, hopefully everyone here knows that the policy is changing, and what's coming in the future is going to be very different. And this is just lifted from one of the DEFRA Elm presentations of what the public goods that we're all going to be looking to deliver from our land into the future. This is how I interpret it. This is how I see biodiversity. It's how I see clean water. I see heritage engagement, climate change mitigation, hazard mitigation, and clean air. They're all things that we can deliver in our own way. The most important thing that I'm trying to do with all this is actually have it so it all complements each other, because this is one of those scenarios where the whole is far greater than the sum of all the parts. And the way this all fits together is just by applying really basic principles of conservation. What we're trying to do is we're trying to provide an all year round food supply for all our farmland wildlife. We're trying to provide safe nesting, brood rearing habitat for everything that's here in the summer months. And we're trying to create protection from predators, from pests, from machinery, from people, from weather, from everything that is going on out there. And that's the kind of the principle that we're trying to do. And just making sure that everything on the whole farm complements each other. And that's because we're trying to give ourselves the best possible chance to thrive post Brexit. As a business, that is our responsibility to the next generation, is to make sure that everything is working well. And we're here at the end of every year ready to go into the next one. That's the most important thing. And we do this just by making sure that at the moment, with really well balanced environmental stewardship scheme options, we can do all that, and making sure all our habitats are really working. And I talk about it over and over again, yield of wildlife. We forget about yield of crops. Yield of wildlife is what I'm looking all our habitats to deliver. And why? Well, we're here to talk about how we reduce pesticides, but actually for us, it's how we reduce everything. It's how we reduce all our inputs. So it's our pesticide use, it's our fertilizer use, it's fuel, it's all the other costs. It's how do we actually run with less machinery? How do we use the machinery we've got less? How do we spend less time on the seat? And how do we actually work smarter, not harder? And pesticide use is as important in reducing it, is as important as reducing our fertilizer use, as important as reducing our fuel use, because actually all these things, when we look at them, they're not good for the environment. They're not actually good for our bank balance. And the work that we've done with the Nature Friendly Farming Network, with Chris Clark and his maximal sustainable output, it's actually not good for our balance within our natural ecosystem as well. So all these things contribute to our carbon footprint, and that's kind of the fourth factor in all that in terms of environment, business, MSO, and our carbon footprint. Is these are all things we need to be reducing and making sure that the farm is still working at the end of all that. The ways I think we can do this is something that we're going to hopefully touch on a bit more in the questions and discussion a bit later. But farmers have to get back to taking far more responsibility for what they're doing. It's actually farmers managing their own farm and using the agronomist as an advisor rather than the person who tells them what to do and following them blindly. I know of farms where the spray operator turns up, the agronomist has already put the spray recommendation on the seat, and he goes out and does it, and the farmer doesn't even see it. That's not a way that we can work going into the future. The farmer has to be taking responsibility for everything he does. But we have to be looking at all the other options as well, and looking at how we go back to having pesticides as an insurance policy as opposed to the first port of call. They should be the last resort when we've tried everything else and we kind of got to a position of extremes, as opposed to that kind of first plan of the year is right, what we're going to use and how we're going to use them. And I think maybe we're coming to a time where actually the costs might make this somewhat prohibitive as well, which probably can only be a good thing for the natural environment. As well as all that, we probably do need to be making sure still that we're using chemicals properly, correctly. We're using them to their correct capability in the right conditions, and we're making the most of technology as well. So we're using the right nozzles, we're using the right hardness of water, rainwater where we can. Let's actually use all these things to their maximum, because if we use them properly, that's how we're reducing the impact as well. And if as farmers we start thinking a lot more like proper businessmen and running farms like proper businesses, actually we do start looking at the costs and how it impacts on our business. But further to that, we need to be looking at it from a point of view of margins, and it's margin over yield and profit over production are the two things that anyone's heard me speak before constantly banging on about. Margins and profit are the important things. Yield and production, it doesn't matter how much wheat's in the barn, it's how much it actually costs us to grow it is far more important. We also need to be looking at what we're putting in the ground. We need to be clamping down and asking of the plant breeders. We want varieties of crops that go in the ground that actually are resistant to more diseases, rather than this constant push on yield. This one will yield a bit more, so it's all right to spend a bit more. Actually, no, it's not. We want to be in a position where we don't have to spray at all, because we can grow crops without it, and that's something that I think we need to be pushing at the wider industry for. And then with the way we farm and what we're doing, we need to look at it in far more detail. Just little simple things like wider rotations, more spring cropping, using more cultural controls, and then cover crops as well, using cover crops to use up our residual nitrogen in the ground, and working all these things in around well thought out environmental stewardship schemes. Not being shy about taking the money that's on offer. The money's there to allow farmers to do environmental good, and hopefully the money will remain there for environmental good. And what we want is everyone to be in a position where they're building a whole farm ecosystem and creating a farm that really is beneficial to the natural environment rather than working against it. So what we've been able to do on this farm in our capacity as the HDB strategic farm for the East, one of the projects we've been looking at is flowering margins. And these three pictures at the top are actually from two different fields. But it's a grass margin surrounding one of the fields, looking to increase all of our natural and beneficial predators. We've built a mindset on this farm where actually the best way to kill an insect is with another insect. and we're experimenting with grass strips, with flowering strips around these fields. And the center picture is a flowering strip right down the center of one of our fields as well. And with NIAB, we're looking at all the different species of beneficial predatory insect that we're finding. And because it's relatively new research, all we're actually doing at the moment is creating metrics for recording for next year. But what we're doing is we're building a huge data set, and it's something that's been really difficult to quantify. But the amount of insects that we're finding in these trials are absolutely phenomenal. Rove beetles, ground beetles, money and wolf spiders, other parasitic species, midges and wasps, and looking at the levels of aphids and parasitized aphids in these crops as well. The center picture there is nest cocoons of leafcutter bees, and there's a lot of work they're looking at solitary bees and how they kind of fit into this ecosystem as well. So hopefully at the moment we really are building something that will really be beneficial in the future in terms of just reducing insecticides. Let's get ourselves to a point where we don't need an insecticide because nature is doing that for us. We've actually I think we've used an insecticide on this farm once, probably in the last decade, and that was a really specific outbreak of sawfly and a mustard crop. Other than that, we just don't use insecticides on this farm because we feel we don't need them. And I use my own metrics of success. For me, it's about grey partridges. And the grey partridges, if the grey partridges are doing well, which they are, and we've just had another really big bumper breeding season of grey partridges, it means the insects are there, and the insects are the kind of key to this whole ecosystem. But if you're a 2-3 inches tall grey partridge chick, you need those insects low to the ground, as well as the ones that we see and enjoy flying around. So making sure we've got that insects over that whole level really benefits all our kind of key indicator species. And these aren't easy to grow. These strips, farmers will need training and need support and ongoing support to be doing these things, as well as farming the fields. And we know that everything that we're trying to do and trying to change comes with additional complications. But getting the habitat right is something that's going to be so important in the future. And it's a whole different skill set that a lot of these farmers are going to need. But with this insect habitat, we always say, build it and they will come. If you get flowers in, you get the right habitat in, the insects will respond, because that's what they do. Some of the other trials that we've been doing through the HDB, this is one looking at the benefit of cover crops and taking nitrates out of groundwater, and it's comparing fields that have cover crops in to fields that have been left on the plough. And there's a lot of numbers on there. I wouldn't expect everyone to read all of them, but if you have a look in the first column, just pick the reds and the greens, and what this is showing is that where there is cover crops growing in fields, we're taking up all that residual nitrogen in the soil, rather than it going down the ditches, down the watercourses. And where there's cover crops, we're preventing all those kind of suspended solids from going into groundwater as well. And all those numbers in green on there are taking nitrates out, so it's way below the legal limit for nitrates in groundwater. And interesting, whilst we've been doing this trial, over the last 5 years, we haven't actually ever found any pesticide residues over any legal limits. So it's a kind of a really good indication that what we're doing from a spraying point of view is being done right. And actually, it's a tip of the cap to our spray operator, because it means that absolutely he's doing everything right by the book and getting it right as well. With these cover crops, it does bring its own challenges, and I'm sure something that we'll touch on a little bit later is how we actually get rid of these cover crops at the end. And the role of glyphosate in destroying cover crops is far, far better, maybe is better the right word, more efficient than having to pull through the soil and undo a lot of the good work that those crops have already done. So there's a kind of an interesting paradox there in are we looking at glyphosate and are we using it in the right ways, or should we be using it at all and finding other ways? But the benefits of these cover crops is incredible for soil health. It's meant that we'd be able to bring sheep back on the farm. We've grazed a lot of these cover crops as well, which in a good year is brilliant, and in a wet year brings its own difficulties. So there's no perfect bullet with any of this. But these cover crops, what we have noticed is that we're able to bring in an awful lot more cover, ground cover. There's an awful lot of hares hiding in cover crops, which means they're not being chased by people with dogs, which has been fairly common in these parts. But also the biodiversity, the ivy bee has arrived on buckwheat in these cover crops as well, that we've noticed recently. So there's no silver bullet to any of this, but if we can start to fit all these things together in a good year, we're heading in the right direction. And also on this farm, my cousin Brian, he started his own trial. And when I talk about farmers need to be brave, he worked off the back of an HDB trial, which was a high, medium and low input trial. So looking at the costs of inputs and looking at how that affects yield, he took it a little bit further and called it a how low can you go trial, and actually found that within this trial, in a very, very dry year, with only 150 kilos of N per hectare, no spring herbicides, we still had a field of wheat that yielded at 9.43 tonnes. Now, this is it's a bit extreme, and it was in a good year for disease pressure because it was so dry. But if every farm had a field where they were prepared to experiment and see how little they could do to still get a crop at the end of it, that would just start to get people thinking about, not all these things are necessary and there are other ways out there. This is work that's ongoing as well, and we've challenged our benchmarking group for everyone to go out and do this and just try things and see what the effect is, because being brave about change is something that everyone is going to have to confront head on. So for me, just wrapping up, the way I think about this now is that we actually have to farm like an environmentalist, but we have to manage the environment like a farmer. And what I mean by that is we have to grow the crops that we're growing, we have to produce the produce we're producing like an environmentalist would do, in harmony, in balance with nature. But at the same time, we have to manage the land to get the most out of it as well. And that is managing these habitats to get that massive yield of wildlife, to make sure that we're doing everything we can for our farmland biodiversity. And for us, I know it works. I know it works because we see it every day. Every single picture here is taken on our own farm. And I know from our own recording, and I know from my own observations, my own ringing, nest recording, and all the volunteers who go out on this farm and walk and photograph, I know that we have a farm full of wildlife. And I know that we're heading in the right direction. We don't get everything right all the time, and seasons and the weather do provide real challenges. But actually, if we focus the mind on what the outcomes that we want are, I would say this is all possible. And hopefully it will set us up for a very healthy future in terms of a business, in terms of our farmland wildlife, and in terms of the enjoyment that we get from our everyday jobs. So I think I'll stop there. And I think if anything I've touched on, we'll try and cover it in the questions a bit later on. So back to you, Steph.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Patrick. Yes, as Patrick said earlier, that if he said everything that he wanted to say about this topic, it would be a 3-hour presentation. So that was an absolutely brilliant sort of short version, which covered lots and lots and lots of stuff. But if anyone has any questions for sort of Patrick to elaborate, then please feel free to include them. I can see lots coming through already, so that's fantastic. So on to our final speaker. Finally, we welcome Martin Lines, who will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. Martin is the chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network and a Cambridgeshire farmer. And like Patrick, he's been reducing his pesticide use drastically for many years. And he's now going to give us his thoughts and a short presentation on the importance of knowledge sharing and what more needs to be done to enable these kinds of approaches to be used more widely. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity of being on this discussion panel, and look forward to the discussion and questions later. For many, we have already heard Patrick say we need to rethink farming and what knowledge we know and where we got that knowledge from. There's going to be a huge opportunity and a huge need to support farmers in this transition to reduce and in great many places remove pesticide use. Much of the pesticide we currently use has been compensating for nature and not enhancing nature. And it's about that reshift back and working out what do we need in our landscape through predators and predator control and healthy soil. We get daily examples from organic farmers of what they can do and how do they farm in the ways they farm without the pesticide use. So how do we transfer the knowledge from those farmers who are already down that journey to those that are starting their journey? And this is, for me, it's all about the journey. How do we pick up the farmer wherever they are, from the fully removed all or just starting, and demonstrating through case studies and other examples the stages and steps you go, without putting them into a cold turkey situation and turning the tap off. It's demonstrating how you can put habitat in place across the farm landscape and recognize the benefits that delivers for you through pollination and through predatory insects. How do we get farmers to use and engage with social media? There's some brilliant YouTube farmers out there that are demonstrating what they're doing. There's some really good case studies, and there's a wide range of organizations that are delivering or have this past information. And for many farmers, they've got to move away from this production mindset and about bringing in inputs to around the supported information they need around which habitat and nature they need. When I was at college or university, we were taught about production of crops and livestock, not about balance and nature and the assets of nature that makes my business and makes all our farming business more productive. We produce healthier food, and how we can transition away from these products. So we need agronomists to retrain and rethink, and to give the whole farmed balanced approach. We really need to embed nature-based IPM, that actually you look at the whole farm system approach, and then only then you look at those intervention tools, if you need to, of pesticides, where you've had a disease pressure or something else in your management has fallen down, or in your crop choice. And I think we can really move this at pace and transition at pace, because as we heard from the beginning, we are in a nature and climate crisis. We have seen across much of our farmed landscape, pollinators, birds and other things disappearing, wildflowers. And how do we just make that stop, reverse, and put those things in place? So we need a clear plan from all of us, and it's up to all of us farmers, public policymakers, to put those steps in place and transfer that knowledge and share and work with organisations, not just in England, but right across the UK. Just because you farm in Cornwall, your farming knowledge can be transferred to someone in Scotland or in Northern Ireland or in Wales, and the same goes about. How do we create these data sets and informations that we can transfer and give reflections on farmers that they can engage with somebody? Often when I go to farm visits and engage and getting farmers on to see other people's farmers, farmers listen to other farmers. Farmers have a great distrust of many conservationists to come in and tell them what they should be doing, or many organisations and companies. But if we can set up and have a structured system where farmers are incentivised to go out onto other farms. If you're a conventional farmer, go to an organic farm, go to a regenerative farming system, push your thinking and knowledge. And actually, as demonstrated by Patrick, where's your experimental farm? Where do you turn that system off and see what happens? Because unless you know what you're doing and the results from it, how do you trust what you're doing? So on my own farm, an Alba farm, my agronomist has a great challenge of working out where I have or haven't applied everything that he's recommended, where I've turned off sections of booms. Because if he can't identify it, I've got to question what his advice is. So we have quite a game nowadays of when we walk a field that he's checking to see, have I done something? And I can say yes or no. But it gives me confidence that we're on a journey that we can reduce so much more. So how do we bring this information together? How do we bring these farming groups? And the Nature Friendly Farming Network is doing a lot of that work to try and coordinate people and bring information together of like-mindedness. But also, how do we reach those hard to reach farmers who feel that it's the only way to farm is to apply lots of pesticide and push for yield all the time? I think future policy will steer us in a direction, and I think the net zero journey will steer us in a direction. But we need to give the farmers the confidence and take a roadmap in delivering that change. So together we can do more, we can share more knowledge. I know we've got John coming on later, and as organic farmer, we need to learn between ourselves what the best practice is so we can deliver a healthy countryside and target our reductions and be proud and bold and rewarded for that outcome, with our consumers engaging with the purchases of the products we produce. So that's all I'll say, and I look forward to the questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Martin. Excellent presentation as always. Yeah, really, really important points. and this knowledge sharing between farmers that can learn from each other is just so vital, and really need to enable that to happen. So that's all for our initial presentation. So before we move on to questions, I just wanted to introduce you to two more people. So John Pawsey is joining us on the panel, as Martin mentioned, a Suffolk-based organic farmer. He'll introduce himself properly in a second. And then finally, Vicki Hurd, who is a published author and head of farming at Sustain. And Vicky's going to be chairing the panel session and the question and answer session. So for now, I'll say thank you very much to all of our speakers, and hand over to Vicki and the panel for some of your questions. Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you very much, Steph. There was so much in those presentations, fantastic to hear. You can tell by the chat, actually, which was really full. So thank you so much, Martin and Patrick. Can I ask now John to just introduce himself briefly about what he's been doing, and then we can get on to answering some of the questions that people have put in the chat, and some that we might want to answer as a group. That would be great. Thanks, John.
Yeah, so hello, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. My name is John Pawsey. Like Patrick, I farm in Suffolk. We're just about 8 miles south of Brest and Edmonds, and we converted our farm in 1999 to organic production. And it was predominantly a diversification scheme. We just weren't making any money out of conventional farming, but I was increasingly getting worried about the loss of wildlife on our farms, but also the state of our soils. And as far as being a farmer was concerned, I felt that actually my life was being dominated by my agronomist, who was constantly telling me to spray this, that, and the other, or to apply this, that, and that fertilizer. And I found myself sort of getting out of control of my business. And since not using pesticides or artificial fertilizers, I feel that I've had a much more control over the decisions that I make in my own business. Brilliant.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, I'm going to kick off with a question that's come in for Patrick, specific one, might as well get practical, about a grass legume mix. It's been asked, do you think a grass legume mix will be better proposition in terms of soil health and other biodiversity rather than pure PRG? That's directly to you, Patrick, but if anybody else wants to answer that, that's from Bill Grayson.
The simple answer is yes.
Great.
The more complicated answer is as long as someone's paying for it. You know, actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that every field is delivering for the farm business. And with the ryegrass that we grow for Barren Brug, it's a crop that we can grow very well with a very well-tuned skill set over the decades that my father and uncle and Brian and I have been growing it. It's something we have all the infrastructure here to clean the seed as well. So it's quite an investment. And I noticed one of the other questions. Actually, all we're trying to do is we're just trying to make sure that what we're doing gives us a kind of a wide range of options for all the worst case scenarios. You know, this is a business at the end of the day, so we're trying to cover every base. Every crop has to generate an income. At the same time, I know someone in there wrote about us becoming organic. Well, actually, all our markets are really close. We grow for Barren Brug, they're only at Rougham, they're nearer to us than John Pawsey is. We send a lot of our wheat down to the Ipswich grain terminal because the lorries hit the A14 and they go. So I think there's just an awful lot of very sensible business decisions we're trying to make in this without kind of being too narrow in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And narrow is fine if you have that niche market and you're very good at those niche markets, but I think we try and make sure that we can keep all our options open because we don't really know what's coming in the future.
Thanks, Patrick. I mean, would you say that you've got a large rotation in order to have that flexibility, but it actually is making the business sense for you? Yeah,
probably didn't push that point probably as much as I should have done. Actually, we know in some cases what's going to be in some of these fields in 12 years' time. Our rotation is set and it's wide, and it's making sure that the oilseed rape is moving around the farm. I mean, not in the same field, probably up 5 to 7 years, and wherever there's grass seed in the rotation, that takes out 3 years of the rotation. We know we can grow 1, 2, or sometimes 3 good wheats behind grass seed. So actually, we're filling 10 years at a time when we start planning forwards. So for us, that consistency and that that kind of safety net is there in terms of the cropping as well. But then we also have quite an interesting chat in our farm office sometimes. I've said to my father, I said, what happens if the public want eggs? And everyone kind of looks at me as if I'm completely daft. I say, you know, we'll be putting a field down to grass, we'll be fencing it, and we'll have 10,000 chickens on there grazing outdoors. And like, we can't do that. We grow wheat. And actually, you know, it's sometimes it is about looking at the marketplace and what the marketplace wants as well. So I think we have to retain that flexibility into the future. It's a bit of an extreme example, but I think we do have to retain that flexibility because we don't know what's coming further down the line. And you know, we have to be able to move as a business. Otherwise, you know, if we're standing still, chances are we end up going backwards.
Yeah, that brings up the whole issue of supply chains, but we probably can't cover that in great detail, but it is very relevant, the demand side elements and whether they're suitably flexible and responsive as you described. Becky, did you want to respond to the question about RSPB and organic that was brought up?
The question was basically kind of why don't we bang on more about organic as being the answer? I mean, and I think it's not dissimilar to what Patrick said in a way. So what we're really interested in is you know, creating a world that is richer in nature at scale. You know, and if you look at kind of, you know, I quoted that kind of, you know, 70+% of our land in the UK is farmed. You know, not all of that is organic. And whilst organic is, you know, most certainly beneficial to nature, you know, to quote, I mean, again, from this kind of Dave Goulson book, you know, he was saying, actually, if you've got an organic field and it's still a vast monoculture, you know, actually that's not so great for insects, you know, even though you might not be using kind of pesticides, for example. So I think that this kind of the great example he gives is kind of applying some of the principles of allotmenteering to farming and saying you mix it up. And I was very struck by some of the photographs that Patrick put up of how mixed up his habitats were, still in a very productive farming system. And I think there is something to be said for that. So absolutely we support organic, but what we're really interested in is, you know, nature friendly farming, and we've worked closely with Martin around some of that, and that is what we want to see. We want to see kind of really good food being produced, but being produced absolutely along a world that is richer in nature, and that means we've got to kind of look at the whole of the kind of farming system right across the board.
Okay. Thanks. Kate, there's been quite a few comments and questions around the issue of the quality advice that farmers need, and it's been brought up by some of the speakers, quality independent advice. And would divorcing sales of products and pest management advice, like France has just started, help at all? And how much of a challenge is it that agriculture and chemical advice is often provided by suppliers? So should there be legislation to separate, to make it independent, really independent? Does anybody want to respond to that, those two questions? Martin, please do.
So for me, on my system, my advice is attached to my chemical supplier, but in the past it was attached to the sales he made, but now the advice I get is not attached to sales. I know many independent agronomists who are stuck in the mud and still trying to improve, you know, push an increased amount of pesticide use because they are scared that something may happen that the agronomists will be blamed. I don't think we should focus so much around who, you know, is the advice attached to the product, because on my system, if I don't use the product, I send it all back. I have a sale and return system with my agronomist. So if I was independent, I would have to buy it, I would keep it, and then when would I use it if the weather changed or the crop changed? So it's about finding the balance, and it's about empowering those with the knowledge, those agronomists, with that whole farmed approach advice, rather than just the tool of the pesticide. You know, and if we break down and use the pesticide next year, how do we avoid it? So how do we encourage all pesticide use to have reduction targets? So at the end of each season, which we use most, how are we going to reduce that use next year? And that's the focus around this whole farm approach then.
You don't think that needs some sort of legislative or fiscal measure to do that? Because I can see how you've got a great amount of knowledge and understanding, but another farmer might not.
I think the ruling should be, the advice should be attached to sales. But some of these agribusinesses have got some really great advisors, and it's about making a system work and a transition.
Does anybody else want to comment? John, thank you.
Yeah, can I just want to flag up that the Organic Research Centre has been doing work on organic farms, but regenerative farms for a very long time. There's a huge amount of information out there. So I really want to sort of push the sort of advice that the Organic Research Centre can give you. I completely agree with what Martin's saying. The only thing I would say is that the difficulty I found, and having been involved in a sort of a consultation process with a farm that wants to go down the regenerative route, the biggest problem we have is with their agronomist who sells himself as a regenerative agronomist. You are still talking to the same people. Patrick has made the point, and so has Martin, is that you've just got to be experimenting on your own farms. You've got to be putting in your own trials. Nobody else is going to do it for you. It's the best possible way to learn. If you've inherited a sort of a chemical agronomist, you really do have to push them out of their comfort zone, and that's by just showing them, what actually really happens on our own farms, and that's by you doing your own trials. But definitely sign up to the Organic Research Centre.
Yes, can you put the somebody put the link in the chat for that? That would be useful. There's a huge resource there. So another question was around growing heritage and landrace cereals as part of the nature-friendly farming approach on a large scale. So developing our own and own controlled breeds of cereal and other crops, I assume. Does anybody want to answer that about using?
I'm happy to say a bit about that. They're an increasingly important crop for us in the way that they do an absolutely fantastic job of smothering weeds. They also add a huge amount of organic matter to the soils. They also are much better at resisting fungal diseases. And actually, we've done trials with them on our farm. And the really striking thing about them, as far as nutrition is concerned, is that the trials we did with them in 2 years in a row, we had an average protein content of 15% compared to 11% in non-organic varieties. And somewhere along the lines, we've seemed to have bred out of our wheats all this fantastic protein. Of course, they yield less, but if we're being paid for protein, that's what we need to be heading for, paid for quality rather than quantity.
Thanks, John. Becky, putting you on the spot here. I don't suppose, are you thinking of growing any of these on the Hope Farm, or using rare breeds in the system in any way to mix the farm up?
I think that's a really good question, and one thing I can't answer that absolutely definitively, but one thing I can absolutely say is that Hope Farm is all about that experimentation. So it's something we've done over the past 20 years that we've had Hope Farm, and we've just put in an agroforestry trial that we really want to monitor to see the impact that has in terms of wildlife. And we've absolutely monitored the impacts as well all along the way. So we've had huge percentage growth in kind of butterfly numbers and bird numbers, as well as it remaining an open book kind of productive arable farm. And so, I think we will just carry on absolutely in that spirit. And I absolutely concur with this kind of sort of emerging theme around kind of taking control, taking responsibility, experimenting. I know that's a big ask when you've got kind of farmers who are pulled in all sorts of directions, but I absolutely think that is fundamental. And when we did all the research around kind of what stops kind of IPM being more successful, it is that kind of that confidence and that sense of being able to kind of experiment, absolutely take control of your own land. That's often what's holding people back, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of takes me on to a question. There's quite a few questions for Patrick about your motivation and when you changed. Oh, sorry, Martin.
Just want to make a really quick point. I think the current system of trials and varieties are built around inputs. We do not have that decent, and going back to heritage, more older varieties that had that disease resistance. And how do we have that proper variety list that reflects the differences? And certainly for organic farmers, they're trying to use the varieties from a conventional system. We need a better trial system to allow us to have the better varieties that withstand the challenges.
Yeah, Good point. Actually, we were putting that point to DEFRA on Tuesday, and we've got a meeting with them to talk about agrodiversity in elms, seeing how elms can help support agrodiversity, both crops and livestock. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But you know what you're talking about, Martin, is more, you know, R&D, etc. So that's critical, really. And there's some really real promise there that the organic sectors and others have been developing. Yes, I was just there's a lot of questions about your motivation, Patrick, and just to add a naughty one on the end, do you think the basic payment schemes and direct scheme payments that have come from Europe have driven everything in the wrong direction? So what's going to happen now? Will it go in the right direction, or you've got a lot of other pressures with trade deals, etc., that could take it in further in the wrong direction? How do you feel about motivations?
It's quite a difficult one to pinpoint, because Brian, my cousin, and I, we came into this business at the same time in 2005, and we sat down one day and we said, you know, there's things here that we think we should be doing differently. And we took it to both our dads and said, look, this is what we want to do. We want to be in this for the long haul. We think we've got some good ideas. What do you think? And it's just evolved over a period of time. I think we're in a very fortunate position that no one's going to get fired here, because it's all a family. You know, so if we get things wrong, we just dust ourselves down and go on with it and learn from it. You know, we're not in a position where we're answerable to shareholders. We're not doing anything because someone else is telling us to. It's just it's an evolution of a system. And I think very early we realized that we had a real passion for the environment, whether it was for habitat management, for species, for what everything looks like, you know, just that kind of that responsibility, but also you know, farmland wildlife has always been my real passion, and the thing that I've really enjoyed. And I can lose hours of a day just standing out watching the birds, or I actually trained to be a ringer because I found it so interesting, and it gave me a really good metric for measuring our success in terms of farmland wildlife as well, made everything quantifiable. So you know, I've seen some of the questions come through, and everything kind of comes back to the same answer. It's just, we just do what we think will work and what feels right from a business point of view, from a farming point of view, and from an environmental point of view, and we try and dovetail that all together. And we've, you know, we probably neither of us are particularly backward in coming forwards. You know, we've always been fairly committed to our convictions, and you know, I think if we want to try something, we're going to try it, and we have enough faith in each other as a business. From a business point of view, that we're going to back ourselves to do what we think is right, and that's how we've got to this position where, you know, in terms of reducing pesticides, you know, herbicides, we're not chasing every weed. You know, we're looking at it from a fairly kind of balanced point of view. You know, the insecticides, we actually understand and enjoy having all those insects on the farm. You know, and walking around with a sweep net isn't a normal hobby of a lot of farmers, but actually I kind of really quite enjoy it because I enjoy seeing what's there. And looking at, you know, weather and everything else, and understanding kind of the bigger picture, and just taking a balanced view has kind of just let us evolve into the you know, the kind of the business we have and what we do. So I apologize for not answering any of those questions particularly specifically, but this is just a really natural progression for us, and I think we always look at it in that the cap has just kind of forced the industry to stagnate, you know, for the right reasons to start with, and probably as time has gone on, you know, we started to lose a bit of focus on our, you know, my dad always says, well, it was created so we all had cheap food. You know, we've kind of lost a lot of that, and I think maybe now we can move into a situation where we can farm well, we can produce right food, hopefully at the right price, with the right rewards, and have the environment at the forefront of what we're doing as well. But it's going to need a lot of money invested in a lot of different areas, to give people the skills to deliver all those things.
Thanks.
Vicky, can I just
sure.
make a point, Vicky? I think what's so fantastic about the Barker business is you've got Brian on one side doing the farming bit, and having an equal, equitable stake on the other side, Patrick doing the environmental bit. And it makes me think about the new elm schemes, and actually the previous, you know, stewardship schemes that we've been involved with. And there's been no payment for the management time that people like Patrick are putting in. And when you think of the kind of things that the Barkers have achieved on their farm, that's what we need. We need management time. We need a Patrick Barker on all our farms, because actually if we can turn nature around as they have, and I would argue that we have here as well, I mean, it's a win-win for everybody. It's what we're driving for. So that would be my key message. We need Patrick Barkers on all our farms.
All our farms. Yeah. How do we achieve that? I mean, there has been a question about elms and the idea of integrating IPM and the kind of things we've been talking about here, which is more than IPM. It's a whole farm, a whole system approach, but thinking about IPM into elms. And there has been proposed, and officially in the documents from DEFRA, that there will be a IPM standard. What do the panel think about that, whether it should be standalone or there should be IPM within all the standard and or something else? There's obviously a worry if it's standalone that it won't touch other farmers who aren't taking up that offer. Does anybody want to come in? Martin, I don't know how you feel about that. Should be standalone or integrated?
The word is integrated. It's an integrated pest management. IPM on its own, separated out, won't deliver that whole farmed approach. So I think it'd be great to recognise and reward and move people in that direction, so they get recognition. But it's got to be bolted in with the other actions, your pollinator strips, your water qualities, and all the other actions you can take, and your soil quality. We can't just want loads of farmers to take one action around IPM, but not to take the other actions under SFI. So it's about having that combined approach. And having progressive steps, because they will start in different places, but we need farmers to move at a quite a fair pace to get to that better place.
Yeah, I'm torn a bit because I feel that it would give status to IPM to have a standard, but at the same time, there's a real risk if it's not integrated into the other schemes. Anybody else want to comment on that? Whether you think, maybe Becky and then Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, only to say really that I completely agree with Martin. It needs to be integrated. I get what you say, Vicky, but I think it does need to be integrated and be that kind of whole system approach. We know so much now about kind of how that whole ecosystem approach is what works, and it needs to be ambitious as well, actually. So I absolutely get that we want as many farmers as possible to be able to get into this new elm scheme, and I know that's been a big driver for DEFRA. But unless we kind of set out real ambition around this, we just simply won't get there fast enough and at the scale that we need to, and so that's why it absolutely has to be integrated from our perspective.
Interesting. Patrick, did you want
when we hosted one of the meetings for the consultation back before elms and policy was even and kind of on the table, when DEFRA went out to public consultation. And I remember sitting down, we had the DEFRA team here in our farm office with a number of local farmers, and we were talking about farming and food production and conservation and IPM and everything else. And I remember saying to the chap from DEFRA, I said, why can't we take all these things and call it farming? Why do we have to be having all these different things, giving them all a heading and trying to work out how we fit it all together? Why can't we just create this policy where that is what we do and it's normal? And I think everyone looked at me kind of a bit as if I'd grown another head almost. But for me, that is absolutely what everyone should be aiming for. And it's not up to DEFRA to tell people what outcomes they want to see or what they should be doing. It's actually giving them the tools to go out and deliver it. And for me, it's making sure that every farm is aware of where they need to get to. And for some people, that's going to be a real challenge. But I think what farmers actually do consistently over decades is deliver policy. And there's a really big challenge here now. In post-war, they delivered policy. They did everything they needed to do. It's a lot easier to do the bad things than it is to do the good things, because they're a lot harder. But actually, we as an industry now have a real opportunity to show that we can deliver this policy as well, and I really hope that we can step up and do that. And I think that there are the factors in there which will mean that it becomes easier. We look at ag inflation at the moment, we're looking at the cost of fertilizer, all those type of things. If people aren't already looking at the alternatives and kind of looking at the direction of travel, then they're probably not doing justice to their own business, because it's not just people telling farmers what they need to do. A lot of the signs are there now on what they need to do and why as well.
Yeah, that the inflation in farming must be driving a lot more interest, you hope. John, did you want to come in on the elms question?
Well, just really to sort of back on what Becky said earlier on, is that my, a big supporter of IPM. It's been going for a very long time. But as far as I'm concerned, there's no rigor behind it, and it's just a tick box exercise. And you've got that on the one end, and I'm just not sure that it's really worked. And I know everyone's putting a lot of sort of welly behind it at the moment. I really hope they do, but it needs to be ambitious. And on the other side, obviously, you've got the organic food is protected by a legal framework and implemented through a rigorous inspection. And for some, that might be too prescriptive, and I do understand that. But you know, to deliver what we need to deliver, there has to be some kind of rigor behind this. Otherwise, we're just going to be back in the same position in 20 years' time.
Thank you. I mean, talking about other drivers, there is a question about horticulture. I don't know if any of you have got horticulture in your farm, but obviously it's a key area, key sector, and yet they're driven a lot by supermarket standards to use a huge amount of pesticides for the cosmetic requirements of the market that they've developed. So with the budget for elm likely to be limited, how do we get the market pulling in the same direction as elm, or as we want, rather than working against it, as is the case at the moment, and particularly in horticulture? Anybody want to talk about market drivers for IPM?
I'll touch it there. I mean, I'm not horticultural at the moment, but maybe I will be, and maybe it'll be inside in a building in a few years' time. The market's going to move and our diets are going to move.
Yeah.
I think we've got to get consumers to understand nature doesn't do perfect. Nature produces things in all different shapes, sizes and conditions, and weather and seasons change things. But we've had a supply chain that wants everything packaged in exactly the same size, and they'll probably wrap it in a bit of plastic and put it on a shelf. How do we engage and move that system so we take the pressure off the producer, the person who's producing the fruit and vegetables and the grains and other things, and accept what nature gives us, but it's healthy and edible and a better food product. And it'll also reduce a huge amount of the waste, because we're pushing the output more and causes a lot of waste, because a box of vegetables that go into a supermarket is damaged, so they reject the whole load. So I think there's some really positive, and I think the consumer is the one we really need to engage there, to re-educate them a little bit and inform them of what and how their food is produced, and why huge amounts of pesticide is used sometimes to get that uniformity of what they believe they want to have.
Doesn't that mean slightly subverting the current supply chains, trying to build new ones? Yeah, good. I would say that, but I think, you know, we obviously need to do both. Yeah, try and get the supermarkets to think differently. Becky.
Yeah, only to say that I do think the pandemic has kind of, you know, forced more of a realization about the links between human health and how we treat the environment, and indeed, you know, what's already here and more coming down the tracks in terms of climate change. And I think that realization is there, and I think people have started to link the kind of physical and mental health benefits that come from a kind of a sound environment for them. I think in terms of kind of consumers and food buying and food consumption, I think that is changing. You know, we have a brand called Fair to Nature, which is all about kind of, you know, sourcing from farms that have left at least kind of 10% given over to nature, etc. There are other brands out there. I think people are starting to make that link. I think the whole January thing is interesting. I mean, you know, we're not particularly kind of a fan. We think kind of, you know, less and better in terms of meat consumption would be kind of where we would go in terms of kind of nature. But I think people are absolutely starting to shift and make choices about the food they eat and the food they consume. Not everyone, and obviously price has a huge impact and kind of, you know, accessibility for people, but I think there is a shift going on, and I think the kind of whole link through to pesticides, in the same way there's been a link through to kind of, you know, lead shot in meat, for example. You know, people are starting to understand the impacts this has on health, and I think that's a big driver.
I wonder if we can think of some way of doing a nature march or something, a Nature-January. I can't think of one at the moment. Nature November. So all your food comes from, you know, sources that you know are good for nature. We'll do that next year, shall we? So another series of questions, you know, slightly touched on it, but around the issue of how can support from DEFRA and elsewhere be helping farmers to do more of the kind of things that the three farmers we've got here are doing. Payment for instance, a whole farm management plan and assessment, which exists in the woodland scheme, but we haven't got that currently in the elm scheme. Do you think that would be useful, getting farmers to walk their farm with a view of not only the business, but the nature and obviously climate? Do you think we should be pushing for something like that? Yeah. General nods.
I don't want to keep going first, but we need that whole farm plan.
Yeah,
which we originally was talking about in the Elms meeting 3 or 4 years ago.
Yes.
So then the farmer will look at the whole asset and what gets produced where and how, and that's journey. But the other thing is, we all talk of elms in England, and the other devolved regions will have their own journey, which will be going slightly slower. A lot of it's not starting for 3 or 4 more years. It's 24, 25, 26 before you can get into it. We actually need to take action now, and that's where it goes back to empowering farmers and encouraging farmers to take responsibility of what they do and what they use, and find ways to actually improve their business by reducing their overheads, their costs, and their pesticide load. And it's about getting farmers moving now, not waiting for government, but we do need government to put some of that payment structure to deliver the right outputs.
How do we get the farms to do that before they get support from DEFRA? I mean, short of cloning all 3 of you, getting you out there.
For the network, we've done the Nature Means Business, we've got the MSO work we've been doing, and the maximum sustainable output. If we move the model, farms are more profitable by using less inputs. If we're compensating for nature by bringing in fertilizers and pesticides, that's actually costing our business, and it's about reshifting this. And there was a question earlier about producing food, or about the food we produce. Are we producing food or commodities? And I think we need to go back to producing food that people need to eat, that is healthy and meets their dietary needs, whatever that will be. And then that will free up landscape to do other things and then take the pressure off the system.
Yes, that maximum sustainable yield and outputs is a concept that I think is starting to get out there, isn't it? Ideally, it'd be part of the farm resilience program for the next year and onwards, not just sort of helping farmers know what's happening from DEFRA side, but this good research and that's coming out, and the kind of things you're all talking about. That would be good. Does anybody else want to come back on how we get the farmers to move before or as DEFRA's schemes are evolving?
I think just something I'd throw in there, Becky, just quickly, is that at the moment we're in a position where commodity prices are high, which for farmers is great. For us, it's great, but actually it's not very helpful in terms of looking at businesses, because actually the majority of people are going, commodity prices are high, I'll keep doing what I'm doing, everything's going fine. It actually it's when you're up against it is when things start to change and costs get cut, and I think if we get ourselves back in a period of low commodity prices, that is the time we really need to be capitalizing on cost cutting and doing things really well. And hopefully if that does happen, the more progressive people will already be in a position where they're seeing the benefits. But we want everyone to be moving along. This isn't a competition. This is something where we all want the whole industry to be heading in the same direction. And I think we all have a responsibility for doing that, and kind of taking people with us and helping everyone along the way. Just going back to the previous question, it was really interesting. You're talking about how we it was to do. I think the question was to do with looking at every aspect of a farm.
Yeah, walk the whole farm. Yeah,
and that is a real kind of old-fashioned estates model. The big estates always are looking at every single enterprise and working out how they get the most out of them. And it's only in more recent times have we kind of, we've gone down much more narrow routes. So I think there's models there that we can be looking at in terms of how we look at what all those old estates do and how they sort of generate an income from every part of the estate. And that's something that maybe we should be converting back into a more modern way on how we all look at our own businesses.
Yeah, and as part of that, the whole rotations thing, which you've got, it seems it's sort of fundamental part of the organic system, rotation, delivering that and thinking about all the rotations that could deliver, plus all the habitats. Yeah.
And I'd also we've actually struggled to find other break crops. There's times when we've looked at other things. We've looked, looked at should we be growing oilseed rape? There was a period of time when we didn't grow oilseed rape, and we struggled to find things. We tried mustard, we tried canary seed. We just tried other crops because there's markets for them. And we went to someone said there was for the human consumption linseed. Why is it all coming from France? Why aren't we growing it? And all these things we actually then found out why we couldn't grow mustard and canary seed. We worked out why we didn't. We combined that with linseed. So sometimes finding these other crops is actually really hard, and it takes a bit of good fortune and all the conditions to be right to get those things right as well. And if you get it wrong, it actually leaves quite a big hole. We had a 100-acre hole of oilseed rape in our profit and loss account one year because it just didn't work. And there's kind of real fine balances as well.
Just going through the many comments now and questions. So I suppose a key one, what are the opportunities and or barriers that climate change will present to the ambition to reduce pesticides? We know we'll see warmer, wetter winters, along with rising global temperatures, new native pests and diseases into the UK environment. Will we be operating a system where our natural predators are overwhelmed, or do we not have the predators necessary for future challenges? Anybody want to answer that? The impact of climate and how we tackle that?
Yeah, I'll have a go.
John, thanks.
Sorry, I think I've just turned my video off.
It's okay. We can hear you all right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because, of course, without the use of pesticides on your farm, you really have to think very imaginatively about how you mitigate against, extreme weather events. And it's about, and this is an old chestnut, but it's just so important to say it's about diversity and absolutely everything. It's about long rotations. Patrick was talking about, failed oilseed rape crops, and increasingly we're growing, multi-species crops on the farm and then separating them after harvest. It's all these things that we can be doing to bring diversity into our rotation, but also within our rotation. So you protect yourself against extreme weather events. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But if the simpler that we keep our systems, the more that we're going to be subject to those sort of risky outcomes of things like climate change, but even just normal weather events that happen during any farming year.
Thank you. Diversity has come up with every session I've been in so far. It's the answer, but obviously it's more complex than that. But does anybody else want to comment? Any ways they've changed their practices in anticipation or experience of climate?
I think we can see the differences with our own spray program year on year. A wet year is very different to a dry year. And in terms of when we're looking at fungicides, especially, I'm not sure that we ever want to be in a position where we don't have fungicides available to us, because in a wet year, Septora will kind of leave us with an empty shed at the end of the year, which actually for us is a very difficult situation to be in. And whether it's all about weather, really. Weather is the greatest challenge to farming, and it's just about being reactive and about being calm and kind of sensible as to what you're trying to achieve. And I think it's something that we've all just got to accept. It's going to be different, and you've just got to move with the times as we go along. If you kind of stand still for too long, you're going to be too far kind of behind the pack at the end of the day. We talked about grazing cover crops. If we're trying to graze in a really wet year, then we actually have a field with millions of little hoof-shaped puddles in that we can't get on for probably 3 weeks later than we want to. So we just need to make sure that we're looking at it, and we're being as sensible as we can and reactive as we can all the time.
Is there a role here for facilitation? Just thinking about that, sort of being able to share resources at a local level, but actually be able to do that through facilitated process. It seems to me that's one of the good things that could come out of ELMS, some support for local or regional facilitation, and that could help with tackling certain climatic, crises that might come on farm. I don't know.
I'd come in there. It was raising the question earlier. How do we empower and reward that facilitation and that local, farmer who's willing to open up and be honest about their farming journey? Because if we want to make action happen, that's what we need, is to have farmers who can go to farmers and learn different things and demonstrate and try and, because if we don't have that local facilitation and knowledge transfer, the journey is going to take a long time, and we need that to happen quicker. And that should be rewarded within the ELM systems. It used to be rewarded in the old stewardship schemes about public access and having facilities to bring people on site, but it's been lost, and we desperately need it. And hopefully it'll come, I don't think it'll come in SFI, it'll be the local nature recovery part, where we can put some facilities on some farms, some toilets, some hand washing, that can welcome groups in, so you can do that safely and get that knowledge moving around between farmers.
I think we're trying hard to get it in SFI as well. I know B is with the horticulture, but thinking about how that engagement and on-farm engagement can work, and the resources needed to do that. There's a challenge to you, Patrick, there on the fungicides. I don't know if you saw in the chat. Isn't that killing off the mycorrhiza you need to make sure your soils are healthy?
Yeah, we're getting out of my level of expertise, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I'd use it more as an example of a worst case scenario.
Yeah. You need it on tap, but it's not automatically reaching for the fungicides. Yeah. But for difficult conditions, yeah.
I think it's a really important point, though, because actually, and this is the difficulty for us as farmers, is that, as I alluded to and in my introduction, is, you know, whether we like it or not, and Patrick talks about sort of using the right nozzles, but the fact is, at the end of the day, when we go out in our sprayers, spraying whatever we're spraying, we are spraying absolutely everything. And, you know, to pretend, and, you know, it's been sort of portrayed, you know, as this sort of new word of crop protection products. If you were sick, you were going to take a medicine. You know, the fact is, we are not just targeting plants, we are targeting absolutely everything. Now, I have no idea what that effect is on my soils or my mycorrhiza or all the other bits and pieces that we touch when we go out with our sprayers into the field. But I feel deeply uncomfortable about it. I felt that it wasn't safe when I was doing it, and I don't think it's safe now. And I think that question does have to be addressed, unless we're going out with a sprayer that targets at the right dose the exact thing it's supposed to be targeting, and we can hand on heart say that that's what we're doing. I'm terribly sorry, but I think it's unsafe.
Okay. You want to respond to that, either of you? I think it's interesting, the development of very much targeted pest control and herbicide robotics and things like that might help with that, but it's a point well put. Martin,
come back a little bit, because do we actually know what some of these fungicides and herbicides do? What's the legacy effect to our soil, our biology, all the stuff I don't know about, the creepy crawlies and the insect life and the biology in the soil? I'm becoming extremely concerned around it, particularly when you start looking into the science and data of that more independent research. But it's about how do we move people and give them the knowledge to do that, and maybe only have those products as a last resort when everything else fails, rather than a standard 4-spray program at the beginning of the year. Or
seed coatings.
But we don't know the unintended consequences of what we're doing, and if we can get down to single application to this single plant through robotics and other things, that'd be a bit more comforting. I'm, as many, very concerned about this blanket application that we're sort of stuck into, and many of us are trying to get out of, and that reduction of what we use. And for me, it's I'm not organic, but I may end up getting there very soon. But it's about how do I transition, getting out the problems I've caught on. My father and our previous farming system has caused our landscape the last 20, 30 years, and unpicking that to a point where we, you know, eliminate as much as we can.
You sort of doing the how low can you go on a regular basis, the idea Patrick was talking about.
Yeah,
in a way.
We are eliminating, I rule out, and we have areas we don't put anything in, so we can see, and then we work out what varieties, and it goes to that whole farmed integrated thing. We have got to take ownership of this, and actually I'd love to see a pesticide tax or some kind of measure that actually costs me money, because then I'll have to focus around moving that, particularly those most harmful products. But that tax should be invested back into knowledge transfer and trial systems to help people move.
Interesting, thank you. I think that's probably a place to stop. Really great intervention there, Martin. Makes me think of the Inuit Farmers Network, the whole research that's going on groundswell and everywhere, that should really be able to take on board what you've just been talking about and think about all the options for pest control and weed control and disease control within a system, in an R&D that doesn't involve chemicals except as a very last resort. So interesting. I've realised I'm slightly over time, but can I hand back to Steph to wrap up? Is that all right? Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you so much to the panel. That was Fascinating, and thanks so much for the engagement from all the participants. We had so many questions. I hope we got through most of them. Apologies for any we didn't directly answer. I'm just going to put Pesticide-Collaboration.org is the website for the pesticide collaboration I mentioned earlier that RSPB and Pan UK are leading on, so you can see how to get in touch with us there if there's anything that you would like to speak to us about. I found that really inspiring. Whenever I come to RFC and Groundswell and other similar events, I always leave feeling, massively inspired and hopeful. So thank you for that. I think we're making progress, and pressure still needs to be on policymakers, I feel, to support what we clearly all agree needs to be done. So yes, thank you very much again, and hope to see some of you in person at some point in 2022. You never know, that might happen. So thanks very much, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.